Everybody to our Zoom webinar today. I'm Katja, and I'm one of the convener of the mindfulness special interest group that's part of the Q community. And today we've got Rachel Lilley talking about mindfulness, complexity, and bias, and new approaches on teaching mindfulness. So just before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. So we are recording this webinar, so you can see the little icon in your screen. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself in the chat box and write a bit about your experience of mindfulness. Do you practice it? Do you teach it? Just good for Rachel to know when she talks. Also, if you've got any questions during the talk, just pop your question into the chat box, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. Try to stay on mute if you can, and we'll unmute you at the end too if you've got a question to ask. Yeah, and then I just want to say a little bit about the special interest group. So we're looking at mindfulness, where there is quite a lot of evidence now around stress reduction, impact on health, working with anxiety. But a few of us were really interested around the evidence of mindfulness, for example, fostering creativity, and generally how mindfulness influences empathy and other skills that are important in social interactions. And we're sort of wondering about how that translates to changing organization. As the Q community, we're interested in changing services and organizations. And so the scope of this special interest group is really looking at some of that emerging evidence in this area. And yeah, so that's what we're doing. And this webinar is in collaboration with the Closing the Gap Complexities special interest group. So Esther will tell us a little bit about that and then also introduce the speaker, Rachel. Esther, do you want to?
Thanks, Katja. That's lovely. My name's Esther, and as Katja said, I convene the Closing the Gap special interest group. And just to say a little bit about that, special interest group was around practical techniques for supporting inner journeys for transforming individual capacities for real world impact in this complex space. So it's pulling a lot of different techniques and frameworks together, and how does that show up in the work we do on change, including complexity, you know, and a number of other things, techniques and tools and such. So that's kind of where our SIG sits, and we talk about stuff like sense maker, which gathers stories, and how do we look at stories for people, how do we listen to each other, how do we hold space for each other. And inside a lot of that stuff is kind of this there's something on mindfulness or something about how do we hold that space, and how do we build the capacity to hear each other, to really hear each other in the change that we do. And so that's kind of where the formation of that SIG, although there are different bits of it that emerge that go into different directions. So that's kind of why the SIGs have come together, because that interest in mindfulness, both just in complexity and change, and mindfulness and a practice, and how it might be changing where it sits in how we think about change. So for me, I work in public health, and so my role is systems and behaviour change, and using a lot of these techniques actually on the ground in community. So I've got a really practical interest in how this actually works in real life, and Rachel's working with me on that project, a particular project, and that's kind of my involvement in this, and I'll be adding a bit to the end of Rachel's presentation today on how that's going and what the thinking was. But a little bit about Rachel is Rachel came to my attention must be about 3 years ago, and she was talking about a chapter she has in a book that was getting published, and I was really sort of intrigued, not only by kind of Rachel's integrity of really getting to the point and really saying how it is, and really challenging and being happy to challenge about some of those things that sit there, but not only that, a background in community development and around social action and around, you know, some of those really really based in the communities, that really real life flavour, but also having delved into contemplative practice and being familiar with some of what the capacities that can bring. So and as well, she really was you know, interested in some of the things that I was, such as sense maker and theory U and those kinds of tools and techniques. So it seemed a no-brainer when I had this opportunity to ask Rachel to get involved with our work, and this is this kind of really why we're here together. So I think that's enough from me. We really want to get stuck into Rachel's bit, so I'll hand over to Rachel.
Okay, lovely. So I'll unmute myself there, and give me a moment to just share the screen. Thank you for those introductions. Let me just check. Okay, so should I hide those on the side? So is that working okay? Can I see people or not? Does that mean that you then see a bunch of people on the side too? Yeah, you're seeing yourselves, are you?
We'll see people at the side, I think, depending on...
So you want me to take that away? Okay.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Leave it there.
That's all right. Or except you can't see the screen. Can you see the screen all right as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's quite nice to see a few people, I have to say. Maybe I'll flick it occasionally so you see different people. So yes, thank you for the introduction. And maybe before we even start, we'll take a moment and just take a pause. And very much my research is about how our internal state, how our influences our attention, and how then we perceive information. And a lot of my work has been around exploring that through research and practice. So maybe I'll just give you a few little instructions just to relax us a bit, take us into a slightly more parasympathetic state. And if you have a practice you do, you can ignore everything I'm saying and just do what you need to do. But how about everybody check out those places that take on tension? So the jaw is a place I always start with. There's always more tension in my jaw than I realise. So just creating a bit of space between the back teeth. Maybe noticing if there's any frowning happening in the face and just softening the face a little. And then the shoulders. Often our shoulders crawl up towards our ears as we deal with more and more in the world, and that's part of moving us into a more sympathetic state in the nervous system. So just seeing if you can drop the shoulders a little. Become more aware of the back of the body, the legs. And notice if your hands are clenching at all, or your legs. And just see if you can release them so they're a little bit more relaxed. So many of us in our working day are holding this slightly tense state, which then influences the way we perceive each other, the way we perceive the next email that comes through. And I'm not saying one state is right and one state is wrong. I think that's an important thing to state, but that there's a difference, and it's useful to explore that difference. And maybe you become aware of your breathing right now and take a couple of slightly deeper breaths. Enjoying the out breath, which really settles the body as it slightly slows the heart rate. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I've run a program I've developed and work with in government with policymakers. And a lot of them now are using these kinds of techniques to change the way they engage with their colleagues and with the information that they're dealing with day in, day out. So maybe you notice now a different internal state to before we did the practice. Maybe you don't. Maybe you notice a lot of thoughts arising as you relax. A lot of thoughts can arise, so the opposite can happen. So just to start off, a little bit more about me. So my background is I'm only recently an academic. I've spent 20 years working in the public sector, largely on sustainability and health, climate change, and the more global sustainability type work. And a lot of that has been around how we support people to change behaviours related to health and behaviour change. And alongside that career, I've also trained as a yoga teacher and worked as a yoga teacher for 15 years and as a mindfulness teacher. And I practiced mindfulness, Buddhist-based mindfulness, for around 20 years, attending retreats, etc., for quite a number of years. And then in recent years, I've developed a partnership with Aberystwyth University, who had a real interest in public sector working, policy working. And so I bring all those three together in the research and outcomes that I'm going to discuss with you today. Okay. Great. So the little journey I'm going to take you through in the next 25 minutes or so is just give you a little bit more context to the research, some initial insights I had through doing this, what's effectively action-based research. And then I'm going to share with you a theory I started working with. So through those insights, I started doing more research, which then started me looking at alternative theories to work with mindfulness in order to address bias and help people work well in complex situations. And I'm going to share with you one of those, which is looking at the reactive mind versus the predictive mind. Just a couple of slides then on how all this then influenced the program that I delivered. And I'll share with you a few quotes that give you some insight to the results that came out of the program. So first, the context from which this work is situated, in which it's situated. So giving you a little bit about my background, about 7 years ago, I started an academic relationship with the University of Aberystwyth. And my part of that research was some action research, looking at how we might support policymakers to deliver behavioural insights, behavioural change, using mindfulness or being supported by mindfulness to help their decision making, collaboration. And that was in the context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is Welsh legislation all about supporting the whole of the public sector to become more sustainable, and that includes well-being as well as environmental sustainability. And it's also in relation to, as Esther said, work which has more recently happened with Active Withensea, and more of a ground-based project, a public health project, which is more about community engagement. Now, the mindfulness-based behavioural insights and decision-making programme that made up the core of the research was senior civil servants, so directors working in health, treasury, community engagement or community regeneration, and education, amongst others. So with the absolute top senior civil servants in Welsh Government. So this is the context of the research. And within that Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, there was a real call for a new way of working. And this is the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, and he himself was calling for much more distributed leadership, much more co-productive ways of working. But what became very apparent, I mean, I've worked with the Wales civil service and public sector for a long time, is even though there's calls for this type of leadership, and I'm sure others might have had a similar experience, there's very little in terms of a route map as to how to move from a very hierarchical top-down system into a more distributed, co-productive ways of working. There certainly is in my experience. And maybe I'm giving you this quote from Mark, which he gave at a recent conference, just to give you a sense of what this programme did before I talk more about it. So he describes it: research at Aberystwyth University used a radical combination of training in mindfulness and behavioural insights to help us see how public servants become more effective leaders, better decision makers, and provide better advice. I want to see all of these insights contribute to the kind of leadership I want to see in our public services in Wales. So that's great validation for the research, and also perhaps gives an insight into it. So in terms of when I initially started the research, and I say it was action research, so I was developing and delivering a programme whilst also gathering data from the civil servants in terms of how they made decisions, what they understood about their decision making and their work. And some initial insights came from using SenseMaker. So some of you might have used SenseMaker. I know Esther does. It's an ethnographic, distributed ethnographic system. And through SenseMaker, basically I gathered lots of stories about their working lives. So senior civil servants, they inputted lots of little stories about what their work is about. And one of the most interesting insights I got early on was that their work, and this is probably no surprise, is all about meetings. They spend a lot of their time, as like my friends here, in meetings with multiple stakeholders, bringing multiple topics to the table, or views and opinions and different information to the table, and having to work through that in order to come to decisions and make policies. And also they work with looking at information all the time and processing information. And they also signified their little stories. And what some of that highlighted to me was that they don't really have any understanding of cognition, perception. So whilst this is kind of their job, perceiving, dealing with information, they have very little to go on in terms of how they understand that process. And I explored this more and more in the research. And what became apparent was that I guess what they do feel informs their decision making is or the procedures that mean they feel they're making good decisions are the civil service code. You know, this idea they need to be objective, and that their code and their procedures will ensure that the decisions they make are good ones, and the way they work together will be objective, will be rational, will be the best way possible. But recent research has shown that, I hope some of you recognise this person from Star Trek, is that humans cannot be Spocks. They cannot, rationality doesn't exist in the form that most of us believe it does. Most of us live our lives in ways that we think there is kind of an objective reality out there, and in some ways we can operate in objective ways, in rational ways, to see what's going on and to act. Of course, intuitively we know that's not the case, but this is how a lot of the public sector is organised. But research is really contesting that now through lots of different work that you might have come across in terms of nudge, behavioural economics, all sorts of studies about rationality. And one piece of work by Benuri pointed out that it really showed that civil servants are subject to partiality and subjectivity. But the worrying thing was, because they believed they had procedures in place, codes in place, they actually were blind to their bias. They were more blind than others in some ways, because they were trusting that procedures would actually do the job. So the next question I really asked is, okay, I was kind of surprised. I was like, well, what do people in these positions working in the public sector, what do they use to understand their minds? And I had various conversations, interviews with people. And I kind of discovered it was a bit like this, really, that what we use is a kind of tin pot psychology. In academia, I found a term called folk psychology, which is a common term that could be applied to physics as well, that we use a folk physics, a lot of us in our lives, just to understand basic physics. And folk psychology, really, most of us are just using a psychology which is based on us living our day-to-day lives reasonably successfully. And that's fine, except for, as I've described, that a lot of that has been really shown to be quite irrational, to not be the best kind of psychology when we're making decisions in a crisis. When you're a elite decision maker making decisions that are impacting lives, you might want to use more than folk psychology. The other thing that really struck me, and was quite a surprise to me, was that there's a huge amount of research now that's come through in the last 30 years on cognition, perception, consciousness, emotions, that could inform us and could inform senior people, anybody really who is working with making decisions, collaboration. So, as I say, I was quite surprised when I saw someone there was doing a PhD, one amongst you, suddenly open to like piles and piles of papers and research. And what I found was that there's been quite a paradigm shift in how research and philosophy and the combination of the two is understanding the mind. And Nick Chater sums it up here, really. He's saying almost everything we think we know about the operation of our own minds, our intuitive introspections, justifications and explanations, needs to be abandoned wholesale. So some wonderful research, but it really challenges our understandings of our mind, our folk psychologies. So what I've ended up doing, so I say I trained as a mindfulness teacher, I've trained as a yoga teacher, is I actually started to question some of the theories which underpinned my training, and start to look towards this new research and what it might offer in order to improve the way I could work with senior civil servants to address bias, to improve decision making, and help them deal with complexity, because ultimately a lot of what they're dealing with is uncertainty and complexity. So I'm going to share with you, I could spend a whole day's workshop on this topic. I'm just going to try and share with you a little bit, just to give you a solid example of what I'm talking about. So when I asked my civil servants how they understood their minds, and asked others and started to investigate a little bit more of my mindfulness programs that I've delivered before, there was very much a sense that people understand the mind like this. I mean, maybe if you gave them the opportunity to think a little bit more about it, they might think it's a little bit more complicated than this. But in a sense, certainly the civil servants had the sense that there's a world out there that's fairly real and solid, and it comes into me through my senses, through my eyes. It goes through my mind, and I respond to the world, react, respond, and obviously it goes through my mind, and I make associations and inferences. But this is very much the process of how cognition takes place, how I perceive other people, how I perceive information coming in. And the mindfulness programs, most of them will present the mind in some way like this, that mindfulness can then come in, create a pause between stimulus and response, and then mean that our response is quite different, that we can regulate that response, which does make, in my own experience, it does change things. It definitely changes things, and it's useful. However, this model of mind is very simplistic, it's in my view overly simplistic, and whilst it's helpful in the teaching of some of the mindfulness stuff, I think we could do better. And I became very interested in a model of mind that's up and coming called, which some of you might be aware of, a more predictive model of mind. And in this model of mind, this kind of theory of mind, which draws on neuroscience and philosophy, see, the mind is embodied, it's the whole of the nervous system, and it's more predictive. So rather than there being a world out there that comes in through our senses, it's more likely perhaps that we are constantly sending predictions out into the world of what we expect to see. So, because this is a much faster way of operating actually than stimulus response, is based on, as you're looking at your world now, the world around you, the world in front of you, you pick up scraps. Right now you're picking up scraps of what I'm saying. And you then fill that in with predictions. You have to quickly make sense of that. And so your mind is going through various potential expectations and then kind of landing on one or two and then coming up with one very quickly. And in order to do that, you have to fill in the gaps. So your mind fills in the gaps. You don't actually see an objective reality out there. There is no objective reality out there. You're filling in the gaps. And so one way this is described is, say you've got a cup of tea there. I don't know, can you see that on the screen? Let me get rid of this just in case. When you pick up a cup of tea, you start to drink it and it tastes a little bit, it tastes like a cup of tea, but slightly odd. So your prediction is that this is going to be a cup of tea. And then maybe after a little while, you realize it's actually a cup of coffee. And this is called, oh, sorry, let me get this on here. So then you get signals back that tell you that your predictions aren't quite correct. And then you have to correct those predictions and you get that this is a cup of coffee. Okay, let's see a few people here again. So why is this important? And it sometimes I think it takes a bit of getting your head around. It is quite different to stimulus response. It's a similar thing when you think you've lost your phone. And so you're looking on the table everywhere and you're looking all around and everyone, and then someone just walks in and points to the fact that it's straight in front of you. There's that sense because you don't expect to see your phone, you actually don't see it. Now, this is a wonderful theory for working with bias and understanding cognitive bias, because it shows how we're constantly reproducing our expectations of the world through prediction. And it's also then a wonderful way of working with mindfulness, but instead of talking about a stimulus response reactive mind, talking about more of a predictive mind in an attempt to address bias. And you can see it here in this cognitive illusion. So if you look, or visual illusion, if you look down, you see the middle image as a 13. If you look across, you see it as a B. So you make that image in the middle, whatever makes sense in the pattern, kind of fit your expectation, your prediction. So in this way, the way we see the world we expect to see. Now, when you're dealing with complexity and uncertainty, it's really important that you understand that your predictions and expectations are informing what you see, and you're not really seeing what's there. And being much more comfortable with knowing that you're never really going to see what's there. And as you can see here, as I started to work, other people working with mindfulness have also started to look at this model of mind as a way of working with mindfulness. Helen Slater, a neuroscientist, a mindful researcher in mindfulness, suggests that, and this was just a theory from her perspective, that a predictive model of mind could be used as a framework to teach mindfulness, and so that we could jam the predictive processing machinery, and so that it could more helpfully jam our assumptions, kind of help us pause and really notice the kind of generative models we're using to predict and make our world, which would then help with unconscious bias, cognitive bias, and create better collaboration, as we see here. Okay. And here's another example, and maybe you can take a little pause here. I want you to notice, look at this image, and this is actually work from Lisa Feldman Barrett, who I also draw on in the research and informs the programs. Looking at the person here, you're invited to consider how you see their expression. Whether you see a more positive expression, a more neutral expression or a more negative expression. So this was used in research, and in the research that was done, it was shown that when people felt more negative, they actually saw this expression as more negative. If they felt more positive, and so in the research they were induced into a slightly more negative state, slightly more positive state, and then that would replicate itself in how they perceived the expression. So this is fascinating then in terms of how our internal states then influence our predictions and then create what we see. And obviously if you were talking to this people, a person, having a meeting with her, working with them in any way, and you understood that interaction, you understood that how you felt influenced how you perceived this person, then that would really help with that interaction and getting the best out of it. And bringing it back to mindfulness, it also kind of questions if there is a present moment. Often people talk about mindfulness being a practice which is enabling us to be in the present moment, as if there were a present moment, and as if there were a objective reality, which really I'd say these kind of models and this science is pointing to the fact that there isn't. Actually, we're always slightly ahead of ourselves, predicting ourselves. And therefore, the practice is more about seeing those predictions, being more open to uncertainty, being more willing to challenge ourselves and to work with others to check our assumptions. Let me just check the time here as well. Check with Matthew, how are we doing for time?
Well, 5 past, so we've got 25 minutes. So I don't know whether, how long will you use for questions?
Maybe I'll try another 5 minutes or so, 5 or minutes, if that's all right. Okay, so you might just take a moment now to relax. Do what we did at the beginning. There was checking out the jaw, the shoulders. Feel maybe the back of your body a little bit more, the legs. Take a couple of slightly deeper breaths. Just gathering your attention around the movement of breath in your body. And as we do this, often we start to become more aware of our physical sensations. How do we feel right now? Whether we're warm or cold, whether we're tense or relaxed, whether we're hungry. And as part of this program, I was working with these states and really helping people using body scans, develop their capacities to feel these internal states and how they were influencing their perception, their prediction. Similarly, people become aware of their thinking, and actually the felt sense and the thinking work very much together to influence how we see the world. And through the mindfulness practice, people can develop this capacity to see not so much the present moment, but how our internal states and the predictive, the generative models that are coming through our predictions actually influence what we see. So notice now as you come back, if you've checking in with yourself about your internal state right now, your mental state, And if you're then just bringing that in terms of how you're experiencing this talk, whether you're experiencing it positively or negatively or neutrally, or what's going on and how those two might be interacting. But in the program, I was very much using the mindfulness in this way. And I think this quote from Peter Senge really helps. With just the slightest pause, we can begin to appreciate the symphony of activities and experiences, past and present, that come together in each simple moment of awareness. Yet out of the symphony, we typically hear only one or two notes, and these almost always are the ones most familiar to us. So I think there's some sense of that there's a familiarity to what we see as what arises, and then that will also becomes a pattern in terms of how we perceive the world. It influences how we perceive the world. I keep clicking the wrong thing. I'll click the right thing here. So briefly, in terms of the program, I've got this up because this is this relates to exercise. The conclusion I came to in the research really was there's some new sciences of mind that really influence how we can work with mindfulness to help us with complexity, uncertainty, and with bias, particularly cognitive bias, implicit bias. And in exercise, this little thing on my right here is a mitochondria, and the discovery of this mitochondria completely changed the way that people did physical training. It meant that instead of runners, like the runner on our left, training for running by just running and running and doing and repeating maybe a few marathons, instead they started using interval training, high intensity interval training, and that was quite counterintuitive, to actually, rather than doing stamina training all the time, to do very fast, intensive training with lots of recovery or planned recovery in it. So in the program, I was working with this. I was thinking, how can I use these new sciences to completely change the way I deliver this program? And I was using it more as an organizational practice. Someone, I think in the chat, or someone talked about, maybe it was Katja actually, how we can make this an organizational practice. And constantly I was referring back also, I was using other theories. The mind's not individual, but, you know, constantly a mind is cultural, social, and how can we enact alertness, broaden attention, reduce distraction, and forestall misleading simplifications and assumptions to create learning and to support the learning organizations. So it's a whole community of practice, not just an individual practice. And I used a lot of dialogue practice. So yeah, really using the development of these capacities, understanding of theories, bringing that together into a dialogue practice. Checking there. Okay, so briefly the results, because and this is just the one slide. I did start, and I've actually run 3 programs since this program, which was my PhD and is the core of the research. But people started to come back with things that did indicate that they changed the way they saw objectivity, rationality. As this person said, I have felt unequipped to deal with those sorts of things because so much of my professional training has been logic, evidence, rationality, objectivity, rules, procedures, and it's driven out what this person called the more emotional component. And I know he was talking about that more kind of irrational component. He thought emotions you could suppress emotions. They have nothing to do with decision-making, cognition. The next person here, it helped me understand how people work in the world, how people create their own worlds, and how we could use that to challenge the rigidity that exists in the organization. A person here, and this was in relation to dealing with an email that they completely misinterpreted to start with, and then realized, and again, the theory and the practice really helped this, how bias happens and how we're deceiving ourselves. We're kind of slightly deluded. And this really shows how it started to link the individual work with the policy work, the teamwork, and then how people work with people outside, how you create behaviour change out there. So it gave me a framework to understand some of my own behaviours, to think about the reactions of others in my team, and from the point of view of the policy work that we do, the broader question of how you create behaviour change and work with people out there. So this has been written up in various academic literature, some of which you can see here, and I'm currently writing it up more in now that my PhD's in, so there'll be more up-to-date work coming through. That's me finished, and I've put my website there. I'm just post-PhD developing a website, but you can also connect with me via LinkedIn. So I'm going to pass to Esther now, just to finish it off.
Thank you, Rachel. And Rachel's on slide duty for my ones as well. So just to add a little bit to, I mean, it's a fascinating work that Rachel does, and I you know, you can see the depth and the breadth of the impact of having this kind of thinking in our organisations. But for me, I really wanted to pull that into a community setting. So the things that Rachel's just been talking about sort of oversimplification, about not being distributed, about the assumptions that we have, all of these things are present in our communities, and stop communities being coherent and listening to each other. And so through this Sport England funded project, and we've just got another, we've got till 2025 now, so we've already had 2 years, something like that. So we've got a good extension. So how can we use the Rachel's training, who trains, she's trained our staff and will train people from the community themselves. How can we help our people in the community understand and hear each other? Really hear each other, so that the community can grow their confidence to create the lives they want to live in their own communities. And from a public health point of view, you know, in terms of sustainability and the burden of adult social care, and you know how all this works, and especially now with COVID, you know, this is really relevant. How can we hear each other? So Rachel's involved to build the capacity for connection through that, being able to just understand that we're making those assumptions, to build the capacity for us to sit in other people's shoes and to know that there is another truth than our own, and just to have space for that in how we do things, having that open mind, and supporting the learning of those other people, not in the frame of what we believe, but in terms of where they are. So that's kind of the project in the community and how Rachel's work fits in. Next slide, Rach. So yes, as Rachel's described, so this is kind of how the makeup of the session is, and how Rachel goes about it. At the moment, we're currently working on how can we make it relevant and accessible on Zoom, because a lot of the people can't, you know, be able to access it in the way that would ordinarily happen. But you can see all the things we've talked about there, and that is really crucial for how the community can absorb this way of thinking and learning. And that leads us on to the next slide, Rach. Is how they, once they've absorbed it, once they've had the facilitators mind training, so they've learned about all these things, they can put their engagement in the community, in their own communities, into real practice. And so we can start to not only affect the facilitators in the community, but also the groups that they are facilitating. So the groups that are coming up with ideas that our facilitators are helping with, that they can then see and model and learn and internalize this, how do we go about it. And so as these projects take shape, and they sort of, and there's more break-off projects and more people get involved because they've seen that someone else has got a project they're interested in, that we can grow a kind of contagion. I know that's not a very good word, but so that we can really grow how people can do this more for themselves, and take that time, not make the assumptions, do the deep listening, you know, making the connections, all of these things, so we can start to grow this in a community setting. Last one, Rach. And part of what Rachel's or hypotheses and all the work that she's been doing is related to adult development. So, and that's very much been the start point, or one of the start points of this project in the community, is what conditions can we put in place to help people grow during that adult development stages. And I don't know how familiar you are with them, but you know, as we grow as adults, helping people be in a place where they can make the shift into seeing a more complex picture, hold different viewpoints in the same breath, if you like, and be able to appreciate other people's truths. So it's kind of provided conditions so that we as a whole, communities as a whole, can move and become better at holding those complex pictures. And there's a load of research and literature on that. And I think that's all from me. Just wanted to really just tip my hat to some of that Rachel's involved with on the ground. And then I think the more time for questions, the better. So I'll leave it back to Katya.
Thank you. I thought that was a fascinating talk. And it reminded me of, I think, particularly at the moment, I hear this saying a lot, all models are wrong, but some are helpful. And yeah, sort of like wondering if, I guess many of these mindfulness programs originally came from like the Buddhist mindfulness approach, and obviously were probably a bit oversimplified. While I guess the original thinking is acknowledging quite a lot of complexity, we've sort of like linearized it a bit too much. So I thought it was a really fascinating talk. And yeah, would really invite everyone to ask your questions in the chat box or raise your hand so we can unmute you. And while we're waiting for the questions to come through, I'd just be interested, you've given quite a lot of examples of, I guess, individual reflection of during or after the program. Have you got like or maybe Esther, have you got like an example of a decision-making process that worked really differently through or after the program that you could describe?
So after the program, I don't know if this fits your case, but people started to work very differently in teams. So some of the directors basically said that they would go into a team situation where a decision had to be made, thinking that they needed to have the answer at the beginning, really, and engaging with the team in that way. And instead, because they could see that there was no way that they could actually were seeing the whole picture and they were bringing their own bias to the situation, they said, well, we kind of opened the meeting without having an answer, which was quite radical for them, because the real sense in their kind of hierarchy is they need to have the answer. And they started to say that it was fascinating because they said people did have, you know, they did have better answers than them. They did have different information and better answers. They did also say that sometimes when they did it, it just made the meeting go a lot more slowly, which is true also. And they weren't sure sometimes if it was better to be in those kind of uncertain spaces. Yeah, but I think in a sense, it needed a whole team approach for that to happen. And also people started talking about going into meetings and being much more naming their emotions. So people said, because they started to understand their emotions were a key part of their cognitive function. So it wasn't about regulating emotions. It was about understanding that emotions influence their perception. And they said that would change then how they engaged in the meeting and what took place.
Thank you for this example. That sounds really interesting. And yeah, I guess we always work in a lot of complexity and uncertainty, but often we can't quite acknowledge that that's the case. Yeah. What questions do people have? Do come forward with your questions. I'm sure you've got some questions.
Did I see a raised hand from Paul Ada?
Oh,
a question from Joe Burrow, a question from Joe as well.
Sorry, then I have missed you. Shall we go Paul first then?
Yeah, hi, Rachel. Lovely to hear your presentation, because I've obviously heard a lot about it indirectly through working with you on active witnessing and with Esther, but to actually hear you deliver it is lovely. I was so relaxed, I almost didn't come back. Now, I guess the question I've got is that if we are working on the presumption of predictive minds, and we seek to get people to be aware of their predictive mind and their predictive inclination. To what extent is it possible not to be predictive? And if you do become non-predictive, are you effectively not shutting your own system down?
So we always work with some kind of assumption without knowing it, underlying assumption of how, you know, we're perceiving the world, don't we? Whether right now, we're all working with an underlying belief about what's happening in terms of our mind's perception. And that's based on, well, I said folk psychology, whatever, if we've studied this or we've studied that, or maybe we've got a faith-based kind of belief in what's happening, there's always something informing it. So using a predictive kind of belief and understanding is it doesn't really change anything, it just means that becomes our underlying informing, which potentially, and this is early days, it's just potentially then changes the way we see how we're viewing the world and how others. And if we have a shared view of that, then it's going to, what I found also in teams is people are much more willing, it becomes obvious that you should question your assumptions all the time, and that others, and we'd question each other's, and we'd check in with each other much more. So that meant that people are much more happy to work with mistakes and much more open. And that's another thing that kind of came out of it, is people, all the kind of things that we want from kind of learning organisations, Peter Sengi's work around there. With this kind of understanding of mind and these practices, it just adds another capacity and theory which actually would support what a lot of people are saying already.
Okay, so let me see what effect that's had on my question. So what I'm hearing you say is that the approach doesn't necessarily mean or imply that you reduce the predictive nature, just that you accept it as a different frame of reference, a different, if like, equivalent to belief. And by doing that, by making it more evident, you are actually able to engage with the predictions, both yours and others, in a more productive way. Yeah, I'll buy that. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's it. And then the mindfulness helps that, because you build your capacity to notice your internal state and your mental state, and the combination of the two and how that's informing. It's just feedback in the system that you're a lot more aware of. So mindfulness is incredibly helpful at doing that.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. There have been a couple of questions in the chat, so we've got 4 minutes left, so I think might have to combine a couple of them. So Jo Mary asks about our work involves loads of networks, bringing people from different organizations together. Is there an opportunity to use mindfulness, create the safe space required to make these effective when we bring people across organizations and patient pathways together? Is one question. And then there is another question around the benefits outlined, such as understanding emotions, more capacity to see more influence. How can we practically apply this in QI, especially in this uncertain times with COVID? Could you say a bit more about that sort of area, Rachel?
Yeah, definitely. So actually recently I've been interviewing some of the senior civil servants, one of whom's running a health board right now. So obviously he's working with this and one who's working in a legal area, and they're both saying that they're finding this work really helpful, because they feel like they were already had the kind of understanding of emotions, the understanding of prediction, their capacity to be with uncertainty. I mean, I could be a bit confirmation bias here, couldn't I, because it's my program, but those people are saying that it's enormously helpful, that they're finding two things. That people who maybe haven't done the program, there's a set of people who actually are becoming incredibly flexible and open overnight without any training at all. So actually a crisis in itself does that to people, and what they've got is just a bit more understanding which helps them with that. But then there's a bunch of people who are becoming very fixed in a crisis. You know, they're kind of defaulting to habitual ways of working and decision making, and there's nothing that can change that, because there's no shared narrative or beliefs or understanding that they can use to actually work with that person. So in that sense, they're stuck, and that person is probably working with a particular model of mind and understanding of themselves, which means it's very difficult for them to become more flexible. So I think it's got enormous potential, and it does seem to be really helping people who are dealing with the crisis right now. And I think is key in terms of networks and building stakeholder type meetings, because I think we do need more than some of the existing mindfulness offers, without wanting to be too critical. But if we have a sense, sometimes with the existing mindfulness, there can be sense that we can all kind of be in the present moment, that there is a present moment that exists, that we can all kind of see objectively and be in objectively. Whereas, and I know it's more nuanced than that, and we haven't really got much time to go into that, but actually what we probably need to be able to see is why we're all so different, and have a shared understanding of that, and then practices that really enable us to explore that. There is no objective reality, there is no present moment, but we can be with that.
Thank you. I think that's also really good concluding words, because we've run out of time now. There have been a couple more questions in the chat, which I don't think we'll get as part of the webinar. Just wanted to thank you and Esther again for this really informative hour. I'd ask everyone, if you've got any suggestions for future topics to cover, please pop them into the chat box, and we'll make the video available. And just want, if anyone has to leave right now, so it's 1:30. Rachel, if you're happy to stick around a couple more minutes, we might be able to cover a couple more questions, but don't feel obliged.
No, I'm fine. I'm just at home, you know. Yeah.
Most of us at the moment.
Yeah, no, I've got time, a few minutes definitely. It's lovely to have the questions and feedback. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's been a question by Ambush, I hope I pronounced that right, again around quality improvement. When we define a problem, that stage would really benefit from jamming the predictive, as you've mentioned before. So I guess you're giving a bit of a framework around this, but is there anything else that you could sort of like recommend from your perspective for that? Yeah, if you're working on a quality improvement program at that sort of defining the problem stage, what you could do?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm sure what kind of a framework exactly. I mean, I work with a lot of behavior change models as well, because I do work on behavior change. So when I see framework, I mean, I know there's COM-B model, behavior change wheel, I work with the ISM model. What I find then is working with the predictive mind just really helps people be a little bit more, most of those models say, you know, are about defining problems, working with problems, but that being a very fluid process, that, you know, it's never stagnant. So I mean, I think the predictive mind model does really help with that. Most behavior change processes really benefit from that kind of view. Yeah. Not sure how helpful I am. I noticed there was one on someone said something about the autistic, sorry to catch a, but I thought that was very interesting, because I think that's right, where somebody said something about people with autism are seen are very granular in their experience of the world.
Yeah, that was Alexandra's question. Do you want to say a bit more, say a bit about that, if you know?
Yeah, so I think there's something in there in terms of explaining that they have a more of a sense of, there's a book by Andy Clark which looks at this work of predictive mind, and he talks about autism, and yeah, they're them being less inference potential. So people are actually getting more of what is out there without the kind of prediction. So in theory, are seeing more, but it's almost too much, you know, because our predictions actually kind of filter stuff down so that we can operate in the world quickly. When actually, if we actually took in the whole world as it is, it would just be too much. I mean, that's why we need these kind of processes to kind of narrow down. But it's seeing that we can only ever see a limited view. And even if we practice mindfulness, we're only ever seeing a limited view. Yeah, so thank you for that.
That's another really interesting perspective on this. I think the final question was around how can become mindfulness training part of cultural practice, considering cultural and behavior change is slow, risk of disagreement and dropout, particularly when it's seen most effective when the whole team uses the approach. So this was from Natalie, who's also still on the call. I think you said a little bit about that, but anything more you want to expand on?
Yeah, thanks for that, Natalie. So this is really interesting. I mean, for the most interesting or the satisfying experience that I've had are where people have come to the program quite skeptical about mindfulness, and without any real not really questioning how they make their decisions at all. And then we drill down into this, and they kind of go, oh, this makes perfect sense. That most people basically, they have no understanding of their job, really. You know, the thing they're using to do their job day in, day out. It would be like if you were a Formula One racing car driver, but you had no understanding of your car. You just a Formula One car. You've just driven your family car around for a few years. So in terms of culture change, I think if we all had a very different shared understanding of mind, and really people ought to have an understanding of mind to do their job as a kind of basic, then I think it would be interesting to know how that's changed the culture, because it would change our whole kind of language of how we're dealing with each other. And I'm currently working with with quite a large number from one department, and that is then they're having a different kind of shared language of how they understand their perception, their emotions, which does start to seemingly shift. And it's not actually asking people to believe something. In a way, it's a basic skill. It's a basic piece of information that people just haven't got. Does that make sense, Katja? Or am I just getting tired?
That makes perfect sense, particularly giving people a shared language to talk about stuff. And I guess you're giving them tools that they can then test, so they don't have to believe in anything. They can test and see how it works. So just to wrap up, a final question from Alexandra around how does your model fit with the idea of a fast, lower brain unconscious versus slow, higher brain cognitive processing of environmental stimuli? So that's, I guess, the fast and slow thinking literature that she's referring to.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question, Alexandra. And actually, my work does include and started with some reference to fast and slow thinking, and refers a lot to the work of Daniel Kahneman. And in some ways, I started pointing the same kind of critique back to behavior change, fast and slow thinking, that I did to mindfulness, that actually that fast versus slow thinking is a very outdated and oversimplified view of mind, which a lot of literatures are. It's useful, and it's useful for people because it does kind of give them another way of viewing their mind, but it is oversimplified. And when we're dealing with elite decision makers making very, critical decisions, I think we need more than that. And that early work is quite old now. Kahneman's work is based on quite old cognitive psychology.
Thank you. I think that's also really timely when we're looking at, for example, the involvement of this sort of like behavioral insights type thinking in the current crisis.
yeah, that it's amazing, their involvement right now. And that's because that I could be doing another webinar around behavioral insights, because that was the other half of this. And so there's how those two then come together, but that's a much bigger topic than we've got time for right now.
Yeah. And I think it's, again, one of those, I think what you've talked about today with the classic or like the standard mindfulness programs, and what you've talked about just now with like the behavioral insights, it's two approaches that in a way are simplified, and so they become very attractive and quite popular, because I guess often the reality with its complexities and uncertainties it isn't quite as digestible often. Anyway, I don't want to, Alexandra, there's another follow-up question, but I would really like to wrap this up now, if possible. And thank everyone who's joined us today and also stayed for 10 minutes longer. Really great to have you all on the call. Thanks, Rachel and Esther. Thanks for all your questions. Hope you join us again soon. We'll make the video available on YouTube and send you the link. Thank you.